The arena buzzed with a nervous energy of players, forced into a fight for survival. It had been days since the games had begun, and the wear and tear of your body and the spirit was undeniable. Yet despite everything, you remained kind, too kind for a game like this, and that kindness made you a target. Hey YN, how'd you manage to trip twice during the last round? Honestly, you're just here to entertain us, right? One of the louder contestants, a wiry man with an unnerving grin, cheered. His companions laughed, and their voices echoing off the stark walls of the common area. You bit your lip, heat creeping up on your face. You weren't a confrontational type of person by nature, and it wasn't like you could retaliate anyway. Drawing more attention to yourself was a death sentence, so you did what you always did, and you ignored it. "Aww, look, they're shy now," another voice chimed in. The laughter escalated. What you didn't notice, though, was a pair of sharp eyes watching from across the room. Thanos, or Player 230, as most knew him. He sat on one of the benches, sharpening a makeshift shiv he'd fashioned from a broken metal plate. He'd been watching for a while now. Ever since the games had begun, he'd been watching you. At first, he found you absolutely ridiculous. Your gentle demeanor had no place in a nightmare hellhole like this. And the way you tripped over yourself or hesitated to make harsh choices was frankly dorky. But somehow the same softness intrigued him. While everyone else seemed to lose their humanity the longer they were here, you seemed to cling to yours. It wasn't practical, it wasn't smart, but it was you. "Hey." Thanos' voice cut through the laughter like a blade, low and dangerous. The group of bullies froze as he stood up, his towering frame casting imposing shadows over them. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached. "We were just joking," the wiry man stammered, his bravo evaporating under his glare. "Yeah. Funny how the joke seems to stop when someone bigger shows up." Thanos tilted his head, his sharp features unreadable. "Scram." The group scattered like a group of frightened mice, muttering half-hearted apologies as they went. Thanos didn't watch them leave, his eyes were on you. "You good?" he asked, voice gruff and almost unnerving. You nodded quickly, though your hands trembled slightly. Yeah, thank you. You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, slipping the shiv into his pocket. "They were annoying me, that's all." Despite his indifferent tone, you knew better. You'd seen him watching out for you during the rounds. Subtly, but it was there. He had deliberately slowed his pace in the honeycomb game, ensuring you didn't fall behind during the tug-of-war. His grip had tightened around the rope once he noticed you were struggling, anchoring the team with his strength. Still, I appreciate it." You smiled, offering a little bit of kindness to him. They all smirked, his eyes flicking over to you briefly. "You're a dork. You know that?" Your smile flattened, and he cursed himself internally for how harsh it kind of sounded. But I guess it's not the worst thing to be," he added quickly, rubbing the back of his neck. He blinked in surprise before laughing. "I'll take that as a compliment." "Don't push your luck," he muttered, but the corners of his mouth twitched upwards. The next round was brutal, a twisted variation of musical chairs. The game required players to scramble for limited spaces when the music stopped. Those left without a space would be eliminated. You were determined to survive, but the competition was fierce. Bodies slammed into each other as the people fought tooth and nail for survival. And your smaller frame didn't help either. You found yourself shoved aside repeatedly. By the final scramble, there were around 2 chairs left and 3 players. You, Thanos, and the wiry man who had mocked you earlier. The music stopped. You lunged for the nearest chair, but the man was faster, shoving you out of the way. You hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of you. Panic stepped in as you realized there was only 1 chair left. Thanos stood in front of it. For a brief moment, his eyes met yours. You expected him to sit down to save himself. That was the only logical choice. Instead, he did something that you'd never really forget. He grabbed the wiry man by his collar and yanked him back with inhuman strength, throwing him off his balance before the man could recover. Thanos pushed you towards the chair. "Sit," he barked. You hesitated, shocked, but the desperation in his voice snapped you out of it. You scrambled to the seat just as the buzzer sound went off, signaling the end of the round. The man's screams were cut short by the gunfire that followed. The room fell silent, save for the pounding of your heart. Back in the common area, you approached Thanos curiously. He leaned against a wall, arms crossed, his usual stoic expression in place. "Why'd you do that?" you asked, your voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at you, then away. "Don't read into it. He was pissing me off." You frowned. "That's not a reason to save me." He sighed, rubbing a hand through his bright hair. "Look, I'm not good at this whole explaining thing. He stopped, his jaw tightening. You're not really like the others here, okay? You don't deserve to go out like that." Your chest tightened. For someone as guarded and seemingly crazy as Thanos, that was a particularly wild confession. "Thank you," he said softly. For everything." He grunted in response, clearly uncomfortable with the aroma you were having. But as he turned to leave, he called after you. "Hey, YN." You looked back at him, surprised. "You better not die on me, dork." A genuine smile spread across your face in what felt like ages. "I'll do my best, tough guy." For the first time since the games began, you felt like you might actually stand a chance. The nights in the dormitory were worse. Lights clicked off sharply, plunging the rooms into darkness. That pressed down on you like a weight. There was no escaping from the eerie silence, save for the occasional shuffling of restless players. You'd gotten used to hearing the faint whispers of others, scheming or crying or simply just trying to make peace with their circumstances. But tonight it was a nightmare that jolted you awake. Your heart raced as you sat up, the remains of your dream clinging to you like cobwebs. You'd seen their faces, those you'd watched die, the cold, detached masks of the guards, and the empty ones that tried to hurt you. The vividness made it feel so real. You swallowed hard, trying to just shake off the fear, but it wouldn't leave. Turning your head, you noticed a figure sitting against the far wall, faintly illuminated by the dim emergency lights overhead. Thanos. He wasn't asleep. Of course not. You actually doubted he even truly rested. Something about his steady presence had calmed you down. Before you could even overthink it, you slipped across the bunk and padded quietly across the room, your bare feet barely making a sound against the cold floor. Can't sleep either," you whispered, careful not to wake anyone. He looked at you, his sharp features casting a shadow. His amber eyes glinted faintly on you, for a long moment before you nodded. Towards the spot next to him, you took it as an invitation and sat down, rubbing your arms around your knees. "You look like hell," he muttered, though his voice wasn't as evil as it was before. "Thanks," you replied dryly, though there was no humor in your tone. Nightmares." He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the dark. When he finally spoke up, his voice was quieter than usual. "What'd you see?" he asked. You hesitated, unsure of how much you really wanted to share, but something about being with him made it easier to open up. "The games, the people we've lost, like, they're all just stuckering in my head, and I keep wondering if I'll end up like them." Thanos shifted, leaning back against the wall. "You're not dead yet." "Not yet," you agreed, though the words felt heavy. "But I don't know how much longer I can keep going." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system. Then, to your surprise, he spoke again. "You're tougher than you think," he said, his tone a matter-of-factly. "Most people would have broken down by now. But you're still standing, and that counts for something." You look at him, startled by the unexpected reassurance. "I'm just lucky." "Luck doesn't last this long," he replied, his gaze meeting yours. "You've got more fight in you than I think you realize." His unexpected words calmed something in you, even though they left you a little speechless. He was definitely not the type to dole out compliments or comfort lightly or genuinely even be a nice human. So you knew what he meant, and you knew that he meant what he said. "What about you?" you asked after a moment. "Do you ever have nightmares?" He let out a low, humorous laugh. "Every night." You tilted your head, surprised by his blunt honesty. "What do you dream about?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment you thought he just wouldn't answer or tell you to piss off. Then he sighed, running a hand through his purple hair. "The usual. People have heard, choices have made, things I can't undo." There was a vulnerability in his voice that caught you off guard. Dennis always seemed so unshakable, so in control, so happy to admit his own fears made him feel more human, and somehow that made you feel less human. "I guess we're all not so different, huh?" he said softly. He smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't lump me in with you, dork. I'm not the hopeful, let's save everyone type." You rolled his eyes as he mocked you, a small smile tugging at your lips despite the weight of the conversation. "You're not as heartless as you pretend to be." "Don't push it," he muttered, though there was no real bite to his words. Silence settled over the both of you again, and this time it was more comfortable. You leaned your head back against the wall, your breathing finally evening out as the remains of your nightmare faded. "Thanks," you said after a while. He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not telling me to suck it up and go back to bed," you said with a small smile, looking up at him. "And for being with me." He shrugged, but you didn't miss the way his expression softened for a fraction. "Don't get used to it." "Too late," you teased, earning a snort from him. As the minutes stretched on, you felt your eyelids growing heavy and heavy and heavier. The steady rhythm of Thanos' breathing was oddly soothing, and before you knew it, you were leaning against him, your exhaustion finally catching up to you. He stiffened slightly at the contact, but didn't shove you away. Instead, he glanced at you, his usual guarded expression softening as he watched you drift off. "Fucking dork," he muttered under his breath, though there was no real malice. For the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness didn't feel suffocating. Thanos sat back in the dim light, his back against the cold wall, watching your breathing even out as sleep finally took a hold of you. He could have brushed you off, told you to go back to your bunk, but he didn't. Something about the way you leaned against him so trustingly, so fearlessly, made him hesitate. He hated this place. The endless games, the constant dread, the hollow, desperate people, the clawing for survival, but you seemed different. You were the only thing here that reminded him something was worth fighting for. The thought unsettled him. He didn't want to care about anyone here. Caring meant weakness, and weakness was a distraction and a liability. But something about the way you wormed your way past the walls he had built around himself. With every round, every small moment you shared, every minute you proved to him that there was still a glimmer of humanity in this fucking hellhole. And now, you slept against his shoulder, your trust in him so blaringly obvious. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He was used to this, not to people relying on him. That was definitely not people choosing him. But maybe he didn't hate it as much as he thought. He shifted slightly, careful to not wake you. And he let his head rest against the wall, his eyes scanning on the room for any sort of threats. but his thoughts were elsewhere. You stirred hours later, groggily blinking as the faint light's dawn filtered through the cracks of the curtains of the big dormitory. You hadn't meant to fall asleep, let alone on Thanos, but as you realized you were, a small wave of embarrassment washed over you. "Sorry," he mumbled, pulling away. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," he interrupted, his voice low and steady. You glanced up at him, surprised, but his usual sharpness wasn't there. He looked almost relaxed. "You needed it," he said simply, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. Your lips curved into a small smile. "Thank you." He rolled his eyes, but he didn't miss the way his lips twitched as if suppressing his own. The other players began to stir, the room filling with the usual tension and murmured conversations. Thanos stood, offering you a hand. You hesitated for a moment before taking it, and his grip felt firm. He helped you to your feet. "You stood close to me today," he said, leaving no room for argument before he walked away, leaving you standing there. You quickly ran and catched up.